You got exactly what you wanted, and within a week the feeling was gone. That emptiness has a diagnosis, and two men in ancient Athens wrote it down. Around 300 BC, Epicurus argued that the highest good was the absence of pain and disturbance. Roughly 40 years earlier, Aristotle had argued something almost opposite, that happiness is not a feeling at all, but an activity, sustained across an entire life. Both were answering the same question: what is the good life? And they walked away with answers that cannot both be fully true. This matters to you because most of what you call the pursuit of happiness borrows, without knowing it, from one of these two men, and usually the wrong one for what you actually need. Before we go further, if this kind of philosophy interests you, subscribe. We publish new videos every week on ideas that actually change how you think. Here is the detail that sharpens everything. The Greek word we translate as happiness, eudaimonia, does not mean a pleasant mood. It means something closer to a life going well as a whole. And that single mistranslation, I think, is where most modern confusion begins. By the time these two men were writing, Athens had already lost its empire and much of its confidence, which is part of why the question of the good life felt so urgent. Aristotle, who had studied under Plato for around 20 years before founding his own school, the Lyceum, in 335 BC, approached happiness like a biologist studying a living thing. He wanted to know what a human being is for. Epicurus, who opened his school around 306 BC in a private garden outside the city, approached it more like a physician. He wanted to know how to relieve suffering. That difference in temperament shapes everything that follows, because a man asking what you are for and a man asking how to stop your pain are not going to arrive at the same destination. Consider a person today who has money, status, and a calendar full of commitments, and who still lies awake unsettled. Aristotle would ask whether that life is actually exercising the human capacities well. Epicurus would ask why the person keeps disturbing themselves with things they do not need. Both diagnoses are real. But they point in different directions, and the direction you choose quietly decides how you'll spend the next decade. What Aristotle said about that direction contradicts what most people assume they're chasing. In the Nicomachean Ethics, roughly at 1098a, Aristotle gives his definition plainly: the human good turns out to be an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are several virtues, in accordance with the best and most complete. Read that slowly. Happiness is an activity, energia, not a state you fall into. This is why he insisted that a single good afternoon, or even a good month, tells you almost nothing, because he added that happiness requires a complete life. One swallow does not make a summer, he wrote, and one day does not make a man blessed. What this reveals is a standard that modern language has almost entirely lost. When we say we want to be happy, we usually mean we want to feel a certain way. Aristotle would say you've named the symptom and missed the thing. A musician is not a musician when he happens to feel musical, he is a musician when he plays well, consistently, over years. Happiness works the same way. It is what your life is doing, not what your mood reports. And yet, if happiness is activity done well, a harder question follows: done well according to what? Epicurus answered that question with a word that has caused 2,000 years of misunderstanding: pleasure. In his letter to Menicius, written around 300 BC, he states that pleasure is the beginning and end of the blessed life. But he immediately clarifies what he does not mean. When we say pleasure is the goal, he writes, we do not mean the pleasures of the profligate or those that consist in sensuality, we mean freedom from pain in the body and from disturbance in the soul. That second condition has its own name, ataraxia, tranquility, the mind no longer agitated. So the Epicurean good is not indulgence, it is a quiet, undisturbed life with pain removed. Picture someone tonight who could order anything, go anywhere, buy whatever appears on a screen, and who feels a low, constant hum of restlessness underneath it all. Epicurus would say the restlessness is the real problem, and no purchase will touch it, because the desire itself is the disturbance. He distinguished natural and necessary desires, like food and shelter, from empty ones, like fame and unlimited wealth. Master the difference, he taught, and peace becomes almost cheap. Here's where I have to correct the popular picture entirely, because almost everything the word Epicurean now suggests is wrong. Today, calling someone an Epicurean means they love fine food and luxury, the exact opposite of what the man taught. The historical Epicurus lived on bread and water and considered a piece of cheese an occasion. "Send me a pot of cheese," he once wrote to a friend, "so that I may feast whenever I like." That was his idea of extravagance. The slander started early. Rival schools, especially some Stoics and later Christian writers, painted the garden as a den of gluttony, partly because Epicurus admitted women and enslaved people as students, which scandalized respectable Athens. I'll admit I once repeated the lazy version myself, Epicurus, the pleasure guy. I was wrong, and the primary texts embarrassed that reading completely. What he actually argued is closer to minimalism than hedonism. Reduce your desires until the ones that remain are easy to satisfy, and the fear that drives most desire quietly drains away. He even ranked friendship above almost every other good, calling it one of the greatest sources of a happy life. So the caricature isn't just imprecise, it inverts him. And that inversion matters, because if you chase what modern Epicureanism promises, you'll reproduce the very restlessness the real Epicurus was trying to cure. Which brings us to the sharpest disagreement between the two schools. The genuine dispute between them is not pleasure versus discipline, since both men were disciplined. The dispute is about what pleasure and virtue are for. For Epicurus, virtue is instrumental. You are just, courageous, and temperate because those traits produce a calm, undisturbed life, and a life free of fear and regret is simply more pleasant. Take away the tranquility, and the virtue loses its point. For Aristotle, that gets it backwards. Virtue is not a tool for something else, acting well is itself part of what happiness is, which is why he could say a good man on the rack is still, in some real sense, living well, even if we would never call him comfortable. This is the fault line. Imagine a person offered a comfortable, quiet life on the condition of one small, hidden betrayal that no one will ever discover. The Epicurean answer is subtle, the secret would disturb the soul, so avoid it for your own peace. The Aristotelian answer is blunter, the act is beneath a good person regardless of whether it's ever felt. Honestly, this is the part that convinces me Aristotle reaches deeper, because it grounds the good life in what you are, not merely in how undisturbed you manage to stay. But the disagreement doesn't end there. Test any theory of happiness against the same thing, loss. Because a philosophy that only works on good days is useless. Epicurus met this directly. He argued that death is nothing to us, since where death is, we are not, and where we are, death is not. He wrote this even as he was dying, reportedly of a painful kidney stone blockage around 270 BC, and in a final letter he claimed the joy of remembered conversations balanced his bodily agony. That's a serious answer, and a brave one. Aristotle is, oddly, more exposed here. Because he tied happiness to activity across a complete life, and because he admitted that external goods, health, friends, some fortune, genuinely matter, he had to concede that catastrophe can damage a good life. He discusses King Priam of Troy, who lived nobly and then lost everything in old age, and Aristotle refuses to simply call such a man blessed. There is a hardness in that honesty. It means Aristotle will not promise you invulnerability. He offers something else, that a person of real character bears misfortune with grace, and never becomes wretched, even if the full bloom of happiness is dimmed. And that admission points toward the one place these rivals quietly agree. For all their conflict, both men reject the thing most people actually pursue. Neither Aristotle nor Epicurus believed happiness comes from accumulation, more money, more status, more sensation. Epicurus called the desire for unlimited wealth an empty desire, one that can never be filled and therefore never brings peace. Aristotle, in the Ethics, dismisses the life of money-making as merely instrumental and even, in his words, unnatural as an end. Both also converge on friendship. Epicurus placed it near the summit of the good life, and Aristotle devotes 2 entire books of the Nicomachean Ethics, books 8 and 9, to it, arguing that no one would choose to live without friends even if he had every other good. Think of the modern picture of success, isolated achievement, admired from a distance, defended alone. Both Athenians would recognize that image and call it a mistake. What this reveals is that the ancient consensus, across even bitter rivals, runs directly against the assumptions most of us absorb without noticing. They disagreed about the foundation. They agreed almost completely about what the good life is not. And that shared negative is more practically useful than either positive system alone. Here is my central claim, the one I want you to carry out of this: Aristotle and Epicurus are not really competitors for the same moment in your life, they are answers to 2 different failures. If your problem is restlessness, you have enough, but you keep wanting, keep buying, keep refreshing, you have an Epicurean disease, and Epicurus wrote the prescription. Trim the empty desires, name what is natural and necessary, and watch the noise fall away. But if your problem is emptiness, you feel calm, even comfortable, and yet suspect your life isn't amounting to anything, that is an Aristotelian problem, and tranquility will not solve it. No amount of peace substitutes for a life that is actually doing something worthy of a human being. This is why picking a team misses the point. A person can spend their 20s needing Epicurus and their 40s needing Aristotle. The skill is diagnosis, knowing which sickness you currently have. Most self-help sells you one answer for every condition, which is like a physician who prescribes the same drug to every patient. The ancients were more careful. They knew that the good life is not one instruction but a response to where, precisely, your life has gone wrong. And that gives us something you can actually do tonight. So run the test on yourself, honestly. Ask first whether the trouble is that you want too much or that you do too little of value, restlessness or emptiness, because the answer sends you to different doctors. If it's restlessness, take Epicurus's method from the letter to Menicius. List your current desires and sort them into natural and necessary, natural but unnecessary, and empty. The empty ones are manufacturing your unrest, and simply seeing them named begins to loosen their grip. If it's emptiness, take Aristotle's standard from the Ethics, identify one capacity you have that's genuinely worth exercising well, a craft, a relationship, a form of care, and commit to exercising it consistently, because for him the good is not in a peak experience but in the repeated act. Notice that neither man tells you to feel better directly. Epicurus removes what disturbs, Aristotle builds what fulfills. Feeling is the byproduct, never the target, and I think that's the deepest thing they share and the hardest for us to accept, living as we do inside a culture that treats mood as the whole of the matter. The practice is not to chase the feeling. It is to fix the underlying life, and let the feeling follow. That is the actionable core of everything we've traced. 2 men, 1 question, and answers that finally illuminate rather than contradict each other. Epicurus teaches you to remove what disturbs, Aristotle to build what fulfills, and the wisdom is knowing which one your life needs right now. So do this. Diagnose whether your trouble is restlessness or emptiness. If restlessness, sort your desires and cut the empty ones. If emptiness, choose one worthy capacity and exercise it daily. The feeling you're chasing is downstream of a life set right, never the thing to grab at directly. Aristotle said virtue is not something you decide, it is something you build, one day at a time. Subscribe if you want to keep building. And if you want a daily structure for that, I put together a Stoic daily journal. 365 exercises, 1 per day, built on exactly the ideas we covered today. It is $14. Link in the description. All books mentioned today are linked there as well.